The rain came down in a steady drizzle that morning, soaking the flags lined up along the small-town cemetery road. Soldiers in uniform stood in two solemn rows, boots planted firmly in the mud, their eyes locked straight ahead. A casket draped with the American flag rested under a gray canopy, guarded by honor detail. The air carried the sharp scent of wet grass and gun oil, a smell familiar to every man there. The crowd was hushed, except for the faint sobs of a grieving mother in the front row. The funeral was for Sergeant First Class Michael Turner, a 28-year-old soldier who had died in Afghanistan while shielding his squad from an explosion. His story had reached national news, but to the people gathered that day, he wasn't a headline, he was a son, a brother, a friend. At the edge of the cemetery, an elderly woman approached slowly, leaning on a wooden cane. Her raincoat was faded, and her white hair clung to her wrinkled face. She walked with effort, each step measured and heavy. A small bouquet of lilies trembled in her hand. When she reached the tent, one of the young soldiers guarding the path stepped forward, blocking her way. "Ma'am, I'm sorry," he said firmly. "Family and invited guests only." The woman stopped, blinking in confusion. I understand, son," she said softly. "But I just want to pay my respects." "Michael, I'm sorry," the soldier repeated, more insistently. "You'll have to stay back. Orders from the family." A few people in the crowd turned to glance at her, some with pity, others with irritation, as if she were interrupting something sacred. The old woman's shoulders drooped. She took a step back, clutching the lilies to her chest. "I raised that boy like my own," she whispered, almost to herself. "I just wanted to say goodbye." Her voice was almost lost in the rain, but one soldier nearby heard it. Private First Class Andrew Lopez, a young man barely out of basic training, turned his head. There was something in the old woman's voice, something that didn't sound like a stranger's. But before he could speak, a sharply dressed woman from the front row stood up. Michael's mother. Her grief was etched deep into her face. She turned, her eyes narrowing as she spotted the old woman at the gate. "She doesn't belong here," she said coldly. "She made her choice years ago." The old woman's lips quivered. "Sarah," she whispered, "please." But Sarah turned away, clutching her husband's arm. The priest began to speak again, reading from the Book of Psalms, his voice trembling through the rainfall. The old woman lowered her head. The lilies in her hand were beginning to wilt under the downpour. She turned to leave, stepping carefully over the puddles. That's when a deep voice spoke from behind her. "Wait," said Sergeant Mitchell, one of the senior honor guards. "What did you say your name was, ma'am?" She paused, turning slowly. "Evelyn," she said quietly. "Evelyn Turner." A few of the soldiers glanced at one another. The last name was the same as the man in the coffin. Sergeant Mitchell frowned. "You're related to Sergeant Michael Turner?" Evelyn nodded faintly. "His grandmother. Or at least, I used to be welcome to call myself that." A murmur spread among the soldiers. Private Lopez looked shocked. "Ma'am, you're his grandmother." Before she could answer, Sarah, Michael's mother, spoke sharply from the canopy. "She's not his grandmother," she said bitterly. "She's the reason my husband left us when Michael was a child. She chose her pride over family." The tension in the air thickened. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "That's not true," she whispered. "I tried to make peace. I tried so many times." The rain came harder now, drumming on the canopy, blurring the faces of the living and the dead. The soldiers shifted uncomfortably. None of them wanted to interfere in a family matter, but something about the way Evelyn stood there, alone, shivering, clutching those wilted flowers, didn't sit right. Then Private Lopez stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said gently, "if you knew Sergeant Turner, maybe you could tell me something about him. I served with him for a few weeks before the accident." Her eyes softened. "He was kind," she said. "Always worried about others, even as a boy. When he joined the army, he wrote me letters every month. Said he wanted to make me proud." Sarah froze. "Letters," she whispered. Evelyn nodded and reached into her coat pocket. From a small plastic bag, she pulled out a stack of worn, rain-spotted envelopes tied with a faded blue ribbon. "Every one of them," she said softly. "Until the last one. I never got to answer that one. It came 2 days before." She couldn't finish. Her voice broke. The soldiers around her stood still. Even the priest paused, lowering his book. Sergeant Mitchell took a step closer, his expression thoughtful. "Wait," he said slowly. "You're that Evelyn Turner?" She blinked. "I don't know what you mean, son." Mitchell's eyes widened slightly. "Ma'am, Sergeant Turner used to talk about you all the time." Said you were the one who raised him after his father walked out. Said you used to send him care packages, socks, coffee, even books. He kept a picture of you in his helmet. The crowd went silent. Sarah's face drained of color. Evelyn's hands trembled. He kept my picture, she whispered. Mitchell nodded. Yes, ma'am. He told us that no matter how bad things got, he'd look at that picture and remind himself who he was fighting for. A sob escaped her lips. The lilies fell from her hand and hit the mud. Oh, my boy, she murmured. The soldiers looked at each other, then, without a word, Sergeant Mitchell stepped aside and saluted. Ma'am, he said quietly, please. Come with me. Evelyn hesitated. Her eyes darted toward Sarah, who stood frozen in disbelief. Then, slowly, Sarah's expression began to soften. Her lips trembled, and tears spilled down her cheeks. Mom, she whispered. The word hung in the air, fragile and broken. Evelyn took a step forward. Then another. The soldiers parted, giving her a path. The sound of her cane tapping the wet ground echoed softly as she approached the casket. She placed a trembling hand on the flag, closed her eyes, and whispered a prayer no one could hear. When she opened them, she saw something she hadn't seen in decades, her daughter's open arms. Sarah was crying, shaking, and Evelyn went to her. The two women held each other as the rain poured down, washing away years of silence, regret, and pain. And as the honor guard fired the final salute, every soldier there understood, the old woman who'd been turned away wasn't just a guest. She was family, the one who had carried the spirit of the fallen long before he ever put on a uniform. The rain fell in a cold, misty curtain over the cemetery, soaking the dark uniforms of the soldiers who stood at attention beside the flag-draped casket. It was the funeral of Sergeant First Class Michael Turner, a man who had given his life shielding his squad from an explosion overseas. The small town had come to pay its respects, friends, neighbors, fellow servicemen, but grief hung thick in the air, pressing down on everyone like the gray clouds above. At the edge of the crowd, an elderly woman stood alone, clutching a small bouquet of lilies. Her coat was old, the hem frayed, her shoes muddy from the long walk from the bus stop. She leaned heavily on a cane as she watched the solemn ceremony from a distance. The wind tugged at her thin white hair, but she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes, weary and lined from years of hardship, were fixed on the casket. When the priest began the final prayers, the woman took a deep breath and started forward. Each step was slow and careful, the cane tapping softly against the wet ground. She was almost to the canopy when a young soldier stepped out in front of her. Ma'am, he said respectfully but firmly, this area is reserved for family and invited guests only. The old woman blinked in confusion, tightening her grip on the lilies. I understand, son, she said softly. But I'm family. I just want to say goodbye to my grandson. The young soldier hesitated, uncertain. Ma'am, I'm sorry. The family gave strict instructions. No uninvited guests are allowed near the service. Her lips trembled. Uninvited, she whispered. But I'm. Before she could finish, a middle-aged woman in a black dress turned sharply from the front row. Her face was pale and strained, her eyes red from hours of crying. She looked at the old woman with a mixture of shock and resentment. Mother, she said coldly. You shouldn't be here. The crowd turned, murmuring quietly. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. The old woman swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. Sarah, she said, I came to pay my respects. I didn't mean to intrude. You made your choice years ago, Sarah snapped. You don't get to show up now and pretend to care. A few of the attendees looked away, embarrassed to witness the confrontation. The priest tried to continue, but his words were drowned out by the rising tension. The rain picked up, pattering against the canopy, trickling down the casket's flag. The old woman's shoulders sagged. She clutched the lilies to her chest. I never stopped caring, she said quietly. I loved Michael every day of his life. I wrote him letters every month. He never stopped writing back. Sarah shook her head bitterly. He stopped talking about you years ago. He knew what you did. The old woman blinked rapidly, her eyes full of tears. He forgave me, Sarah. I have his letters. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a bundle of weathered envelopes, tied with a blue ribbon. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the name, Grandma Evelyn, was still visible on one. A murmur rippled through the crowd. One of the soldiers, Private First Class Andrew Lopez, stepped forward. Excuse me, ma'am, he said gently. Did you say you're Sergeant Turner's grandmother? Evelyn nodded. Yes, I raised him. His father left when he was just a boy. It was just me and him for a long time. Sarah turned away, her voice tight. You raised him, yes. Until you disowned me, your own daughter, for marrying a man you didn't approve of. You didn't even come when Dad died. Evelyn's chin trembled. I was wrong, she whispered. I was so proud back then, so stubborn. I thought I was protecting him, protecting you. I've lived with that mistake every day since. The priest lowered his head, saying nothing. The soldiers stood awkwardly, unsure whether to intervene. Then, out of the silence, Sergeant Mitchell, the man leading the honor guard, spoke. Ma'am, you said he wrote you letters. Evelyn nodded and held one out with trembling hands. This one was the last, she said softly. It came just before. Her voice broke. Mitchell carefully took the letter and opened it. The ink was slightly smudged, but the words were still clear. He read quietly for a moment, his eyes widening slightly as he recognized the handwriting. Then he looked up at Sarah. Ma'am, he said to her gently, your son mentioned her often. He said his grandmother was his greatest hero. Said she taught him what honor and duty really meant. He carried her picture in his helmet. The words hung in the air like thunder. Sarah's face went pale. He did, she whispered. Mitchell nodded. Yes, ma'am, when things got rough out there, he'd pull out that photo and say, she's the reason I keep fighting. She never gave up on anyone. The old woman gasped softly, covering her mouth. Tears streamed down her cheeks, mixing with the rain. She had no idea he had kept her photo all that time. Sarah stared at her mother for a long moment, her expression shifting from anger to confusion, then to heartbreak. The years of silence, bitterness, and regret seemed to melt away under the weight of truth. Evelyn tried to speak but couldn't. The lilies fell from her hands, scattering across the muddy ground. Mitchell took a step back and saluted. Ma'am, he said quietly to Evelyn, it would be an honor if you'd join us under the canopy. Evelyn hesitated. I don't want to cause any more trouble. But Sarah's voice broke through the rain, softer this time, trembling. Mom, please, come. The old woman looked up. For a moment, she saw not the angry face of the daughter she had lost to pride, but the little girl she used to tuck into bed. Her knees shook as she took a step forward. The soldiers parted, standing tall and silent, their eyes glistening with respect. As Evelyn approached the casket, she reached out with a trembling hand and touched the flag. Her lips moved in silent prayer. The wind picked up, carrying her whisper through the cemetery. Then she turned to Sarah, and the two women met in a tearful embrace. Decades of regret poured out in that moment. No words were needed. The soldiers looked on quietly, some lowering their heads, others blinking back their own tears. The priest resumed his prayer, his voice steadier now. The sound of the rifle salute echoed across the valley, three sharp cracks that seemed to pierce the sky itself. Evelyn flinched slightly but didn't step back. When the ceremony ended, she stayed by the casket, her hand resting on the wood. Goodbye, my boy, she whispered. You made me proud every single day. Sarah placed a hand on her shoulder. He loved you, Mom, she said quietly. I just didn't want to admit it. Evelyn smiled faintly through her tears. Then maybe today's the day we both find a little peace. The rain finally began to ease, sunlight breaking weakly through the clouds. The soldiers stood in silence, watching the two women, a mother and daughter, reunited not by words but by love, by the memory of a man who had given everything for both of them. And as the last notes of taps faded into the air, everyone there knew they had just witnessed something deeper than grief, the quiet, powerful forgiveness that only family could bring.